East Drive runs in a long, shallow arc through the Checkerfield estate on the eastern edge of Pontefract, and on an autumn evening in the mid-1960s, walking its length would have given a particular kind of impression, one of symmetry, of repetition, of a street that had been designed to a pattern and built to it faithfully. The houses sat in pairs along either side of the road, semi-detached, each one sharing a wall with its neighbor, each one set back from the pavement by a small front garden. The roof lines were consistent. The windows were placed in the same positions in every facade. The front doors, painted in slightly different colors from house to house, were the primary evidence that different families lived behind them. In the evening light of an October weekday, the street lamps would have been coming on one by one along East Drive, their orange glow settling over the pavement and the small gardens, the net curtains in the front windows catching the last of the daylight from the other direction. It was a street that had been built to be lived in quietly, without drama, and it looked exactly like what it was. The Checkerfield estate had been constructed in the late 1940s and early 1950s as part of the post-war social housing effort that reshaped the edges of British towns and cities across that decade. The Housing Act of 1949 had created the framework for a national program of council house building intended to provide decent, modern homes for working-class families in the years following the war. Checkerfield was one product of that effort, a carefully planned residential development on land that had been agricultural or open ground, now laid out in streets of uniform, semi-detached houses with gardens front and back, indoor plumbing, and the particular quiet of a place built all at once to a single purpose. The estate was not grand. It was not meant to be. It was designed for ordinary life, conducted at ordinary pace, in streets that resembled one another, because they had been built from the same plans. Walking along East Drive in those years, a person would have noticed the small differences that families make within identical houses, a particular color of curtain fabric, a rose bush in one garden, a child's bicycle propped against a gate in another. The houses were the same, and the lives inside them were different, as they always are. On a school evening, the children would have been coming in from the street as the light faded, and the smell of cooking would have begun to reach the pavement from kitchen windows, left slightly open against the warmth of the stove. It was the kind of street where people knew their neighbors, and where the ordinary textures of working-class domestic life, the hours of work, the rhythm of meals, the sound of a television through a shared wall on a winter evening, gave the place its character. East Drive was a street that had been lived in long enough by the mid-1960s to have settled into itself. Number 30 was near one end of the street, a semi-detached house distinguishable from its neighbors in the same way they were distinguishable from each other, by small details of occupancy rather than any difference in structure. The Pritchard family moved there in 1966. Joe Pritchard worked, as working-class men in West Yorkshire towns worked in those years, in the kind of employment that required early rising and regular hours. John Pritchard kept the house. Their children, Philip and Diane, attended local schools and occupied the particular social world of children on an estate like Checkerfield, which centered on the street and the school and the adjacent spaces where children gathered after hours. Nothing about the Pritchards in any published account of the case suggests anything other than an ordinary family living an ordinary life in an ordinary house on an ordinary street. This is noted consistently by everyone who has written about what happened at number 30, and the noting of it is itself significant, because what is recorded as having happened there does not fit the life that was being lived, and the distance between the two is part of what makes the case worth following carefully. Pontefract itself is older than the Chequerfield estate, by a considerable measure, old in the particular way of West Yorkshire market towns, which carry their history in visible layers, the medieval sitting alongside the Victorian, alongside the modern, without any of these periods having fully displaced the others. The town sits in a landscape of low hills and former coalfield country, its skyline marked by the remains of Pontefract Castle, which rises above the surrounding rooftops on its rocky prominence and remains visible from streets some distance away on a clear morning. The castle was built following the Norman conquest of England, constructed in the late 11th century as part of the network of fortifications through which the incoming Norman aristocracy established and consolidated its control over the north of England. Its stone walls have weathered through more than 900 years of West Yorkshire weather, and they still stand, reduced but present, the outline of the original structure, legible in what remains. The castle gives Pontefract a particular kind of historical depth. Standing anywhere in the upper part of the town and looking toward the castle's remains on a clear day, the sense of continuity is not abstract. The stone is there, the shape of the fortification is there, the hill on which it sits is the same hill it was built on in the 11th century. Pontefract's documented history runs from that Norman foundation through the medieval period, through the Civil War siege that reduced the castle from a working fortification to a carefully managed ruin, and through the industrial centuries that brought coal and textiles and the particular character of a northern English working town into the place. By the 1960s, the medieval and the industrial had become simply the background of ordinary life, as they do in places with long histories, noticed occasionally, unremarked on most days, present in the shape of the town even when no one is thinking about it. Among the historical details that local historians and paranormal researchers have noted in connection with the Chequerfield estate is the question of a public gallows. Some accounts of Pontefract's history have placed a public execution site in close geographical proximity to what is now the Chequerfield area, on land that was, before the post-war housing development, open or agricultural ground on the edge of the town. This is a claim that appears in several accounts of the events at number 30 East Drive, advanced as potential context for what was reported to have occurred there. It should be said plainly that this connection has not been confirmed as established historical fact. The claim appears in local historical tradition and in the published accounts of paranormal researchers who have investigated the case, and it has been repeated widely enough that it has become part of the accepted background to the story. Whether the gallows were precisely where local tradition places them, whether the land now covered by the Chequerfield estate is in fact the same ground, is a matter on which the surviving historical record does not speak with the clarity that would settle the question. The connection is noted, it is not established. What is a matter of historical record is the existence of the Cluniac Priory of St. John the Evangelist in Pontefract, founded in approximately 1090 by Robert de Lacy, the Norman lord who also built the first version of Pontefract Castle. Robert de Lacy's foundation of the priory in the same decade as the castle's construction reflects the standard pattern of Norman aristocratic religious patronage, the military and the ecclesiastical built together, the lord supporting the church and the church providing the institutional infrastructure of education, record-keeping, and pastoral care that the new order required. And the Cluniac order to which the priory belonged was a reformed branch of the Benedictine tradition, originating at the Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy and spreading across Europe through a network of dependent priories, of which the Pontefract House was one. The order was known for its emphasis on elaborate liturgical observance, for the quality of its scholarship, and for a particular discipline in the conduct of monastic life that gave it a distinct character within the broader tradition of medieval monasticism. The Priory of St. John the Evangelist stood as a significant religious institution in Pontefract for several centuries, accumulating property, influence, and the kind of deep local embeddedness that comes from being the most prominent ecclesiastical house in a market town for generations. It educated children from the surrounding region, held lands across the West Riding, and functioned as the primary institutional expression of organized religious life in Pontefract across the medieval period. Its dissolution came under Henry VIII as part of the program of monastic suppression that dismantled the institutional church in England between 1536 and 1541. The priory's buildings were taken apart and its materials repurposed, as happened to monastic houses across the country in those years, and what had been a working religious community became, over the following centuries, a site of ruins and eventual absorption into the growing town. What remains today is visible on the edge of Pontefract. Low stone walls, the outline of the original foundation, legible in the ground, the general shape of the complex discernible to someone who walks the site on a quiet afternoon with attention to what they are looking at. The stone is old. The ground has long since been quiet. The relationship between the Cluniac Priory and the events at 30 East Drive is a question that runs through every serious account of the case, and it is worth understanding the Priory in its own terms before that relationship is considered. The monks of Cluny wore black habits. This is the historical fact that gives the case its most familiar element. The Cluniac black was a deliberate and distinctive choice, differentiating the order from the white of the Cistercians and the more variable practice of other Benedictine houses, and it was a feature of the order's appearance consistent enough across its history that it would have been immediately recognizable to any informed medieval observer. In the landscape of Pontefract's medieval religious life, the figures moving through the priory's courtyards and crossing the town on the order's business would have been identifiable at a distance by the color of their habits. Whether any connection between those figures and the house at 30 East Drive can be drawn is a question for later. The historical fact of their presence in Pontefract across several centuries in black monastic robes is simply what the record shows. The Checkerfield estate, built on the eastern edge of a town with this history, was constructed without any particular awareness of or reference to it. The post-war housing program was not in the business of historical archaeology. It was in the business of building houses quickly and to a standard sufficient for the working-class families who needed them, and the landscape on which it built was considered primarily as land, available, buildable, close enough to the town center to be practicable, rather than as a place with a layered history that might be worth pausing over. The houses on East Drive were built to last, with the particular functional solidity of post-war council construction, brick walls, pitched roofs, small gardens, the proportions of rooms scaled to the furniture that working-class families owned. They were ordinary houses, built to serve ordinary purposes, and for most of the families who lived in them, they did exactly that. The Pritchards arrived at number 30 in 1966, and by all accounts they found it exactly what it looked like, a small, functional, solidly built semi-detached council house on a quiet street in a West Yorkshire town. Joe and Jean Pritchard were in their 30s. Their children, Philip and Diane, were of school age. The family had no particular connection to the paranormal, no prior history of reported anomalous experiences, no reported interest in occult or spiritualist traditions that might have provided a cultural framework within which strange experiences would be expected or sought. Published accounts of the case note this consistently and note it as significant. The Pritchards were not a family primed for unusual events, and the context they were moving into at 30 East Drive was as unremarkable as the house itself. An autumn morning on the Checkerfield estate in 1966 would have had a particular character. Joe Pritchard leaving the house for work, the front door of number 30 closing behind him with the particular sound of a well-fitted door in a well-built house, the street quiet in the early hour before the school run, Jaun inside, the children getting ready for school, the kitchen warm from the cooker, the ordinary sounds of a household starting its day. From the pavement, the house would have been indistinguishable from its neighbors, the same roof line, the same front garden, the same proportions of window and door. East Drive would have been going about its morning in the way it always did. The street lamps, their work done with the coming of the light, would have been off, and the early autumn sky over Pontefract would have been doing what West Yorkshire skies do in autumn, which is to present a particular quality of gray-white light that is neither dull nor dramatic, but simply the light of that place at that time of year. The inside of the house in those first months of the Pritchards' occupancy would have been acquiring the particular feel of a newly lived-in family home, the arrangement of furniture that becomes familiar enough to be invisible, the specific placement of objects on shelves and in drawers that comes from the practical logic of daily use, the slow accumulation of small personal details that make a standard council house into a specific domestic world. The hallway at number 30 was narrow, as the hallways of houses built to that scale and that period inevitably were. The ground floor proportioned for function rather than generosity, the entrance tight, the rooms leading off it compact, linoleum on the floor, as was standard in working-class domestic interiors of that era, practical, durable, easy to clean, the particular sound of feet crossing it slightly different from the sound on carpet or wood. The staircase at 30 East Drive ran from just inside the front door up to the first floor, a steep climb in the way of staircases in houses of that size and period. The steps rising at an angle that made the upper landing feel distinctly above the ground floor rather than merely adjacent to it. The staircase was narrow, as the hallway was narrow, with walls close on both sides. At the bottom, standing in the hallway, with the front door behind you, the staircase went up and away, and the landing at the top was just out of sight, not hidden exactly, but not visible either, at an angle that meant the top of the stairs remained out of the direct line of vision from the hall until you were already partway up. The landing itself was short, connecting the upper rooms, low-ceilinged as the whole upper floor was, with the particular quality of small houses in that style where the first floor always feels slightly compressed under the roofline. It is a staircase that would not merit description if it were not significant. In most of the houses on East Drive, it goes unremarked, functional, standard, simply the means of getting between floors. In the published accounts of what happened at number 30, the staircase appears repeatedly, and the upper landing appears repeatedly in the particular configuration of that short climb, the narrowness, the steepness, the top landing just out of sight from below becomes a detail that accumulates weight through the frequency of its recurrence in the record. But in the autumn of 1966, when the Pritchards had recently moved in and were settling into the house and the street, the staircase was simply the staircase. Pontefract, on a clear morning in those years, viewed from the Checkerfield estate, would have offered the sight of the castle rising above the lower rooftops of the town center. From East Drive, the distance to the castle is not great. Pontefract is a compact town, and the Checkerfield estate is on its edge rather than its outskirts, close enough to the center that the walk is a reasonable one, and the higher points of the town's skyline remain visible on clear days. The Norman stonework of the castle, reduced by Civil War siege and subsequent deliberate demolition, but still substantial in what remained, sat on its prominence above the rooftops in the same way it had sat there for centuries, indifferent to the post-war housing that had grown up in its view. The castle ruins were a familiar part of the town's visual landscape by the 1960s, unremarkable through familiarity, the kind of old stone that residents of a place tend to stop noticing after some time. The priory ruins were visible on a different part of the town's edge, lower, less prominent. The stone reduced the outline of foundations and low walls, the whole site more easily missed than the castle, which at least had the drama of its elevated position. Walking past the priory site on a weekday afternoon in the 1960s, a person would have seen an area of old stone and worn ground, possibly without knowing what it was, the dissolution having done its work thoroughly enough that the original building was more archaeology than ruin. The site was quiet in the way of places that have been emptied of their purpose for a very long time, the particular quality of stillness that settles on ground where something once stood and no longer does. There would have been no one there on most weekday afternoons. The low stone walls would have held the light of a West Yorkshire autumn quietly, without drama, without emphasis. The town between the castle and the priory and the estate was getting on with being a West Yorkshire market town in the mid-1960s, which meant the particular combination of things that characterized such towns in that period: the market square, the Victorian commercial architecture, the working men's clubs, the corner shops, the small industry that had survived the contraction of coal and textile employment, the social institutions that provided the structure of working-class community life. Pontefract was not a prosperous town by the standards of that period, but it was a functioning one, with the practical vitality of a place that has been continuously inhabited for a very long time and has adapted repeatedly to the changes that long habitation brings. The Checkerfield estate was part of its most recent adaptation, the post-war expansion of housing for a working population that needed homes of a standard the old Victorian terraces could no longer reasonably be asked to provide. The Pritchards, new to number 30 in 1966, were settling into all of this as new residents settle into the particulars of a familiar type of place, learning the local shops, the school routes, the neighbors' names, the small geography of their immediate environment. John Pritchard at home during the day would have known the morning sounds of the estate, the pattern of the street's activity, the rhythm of a Checkerfield weekday. The children would have been learning the social landscape of their new school and the local territory that school-age children in working-class estates made their own by exploration and habit. Joe Pritchard would have been coming and going in the regular pattern of working life, the front door marking the daily transition between the domestic interior and the world outside. The house itself in those early months was simply the house, acquiring the feel of the family that lived in it, becoming familiar in the way that houses become familiar, which is quietly and without event. The hallway with its linoleum floor, the narrow kitchen at the back of the ground floor, the front room with its window facing East Drive, the stairs, steep and close, rising from just inside the front door, the short landing at the top, leading to the bedrooms. These were the ordinary physical spaces of an ordinary family life, and they had the character of all such spaces in all such houses, particular in small ways, generic in large ones, warm with use and habit, unremarkable from the outside, and private from within. The case of 30 East Drive, in all the accounts that have been written about it, is consistently introduced with this emphasis on ordinariness, the ordinary house, the ordinary family, the ordinary street, the ordinary town. The emphasis is deliberate in every account, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving past it, because ordinariness is not simply a backdrop against which the extraordinary is later placed. It is itself a significant part of the record. What the Pritchards were before anything else was a family living their life in a council house in Pontefract in 1966, with no expectation of anything other than the ordinary passage of days and seasons. What is documented as having begun at number 30 some months after their arrival is not something they sought, not something they had any prior framework for, and not something they were by any account prepared for. Pontefract's history sits beneath the Checkerfield estate, the way history sits beneath most places in England, not visibly, not dramatically, but present in the ground and in the particular depth that very old towns accumulate without trying to. The castle above the rooftops, and the priory ruins on the town's edge, the long Norman presence in the landscape, the Cluniac monks in their black habits moving through the town across centuries that are now so distant they have become background, the gallows site that some accounts place close to the land, now covered by the estate, present in local tradition, not confirmed in the documentary record, but part of the wider context that researchers have noted when they try to account for what was reported at number 30. Whether that history has any bearing on the events that were later described at 30 East Drive is a question that no one has answered to general satisfaction. The history is there. The question is there. The answer, as of the time these accounts were compiled, remains open. The staircase at 30 East Drive was, in 1966, simply a staircase. It ran from the narrow hallway just inside the front door up to the short landing above, steep and close in the way of such staircases, the top of it just out of sight from the hall below. Jane Pritchard would have gone up and down it several times a day in the ordinary course of domestic routine, the children's rooms at the top, the laundry, the small tasks of a household conducted across 2 floors. Jane Pritchard would have come down it in the mornings before work and gone up it at the end of the day. Philip and Diane would have thundered up and down it with the particular energy of children who have not yet learned to mind the noise. It was a staircase in a house in which a family lived, and it had the character of all such things, worn slightly at the edges by use, familiar to everyone in the household, noticed by no one. The street outside the house on an autumn evening in 1966, as the Pritchards were settling in, the row of semi-detached houses, the small front gardens, the street lamps coming on one by one along East Drive in the early dark, the sound of a television somewhere on the street, the distant sound of traffic from the road that ran past the estate toward the town, a net curtain moving slightly in a window across the road as the occupant of the house behind it looked out at the evening, the particular quality of a residential street at the end of a working day, the domestic world turning inward toward its own warmth and light, and leaving the pavement quiet. Number 30 East Drive, with its front door closed against the evening, the light from the front room window falling in a square onto the small front garden, the narrow hallway inside, the kitchen beyond it, the stairs rising from just inside the door to the landing above, the short upper landing out of sight from below, where the ceiling was low and the upper rooms led off in their close arrangement. A house that was, in the autumn of 1966, fully inhabited and entirely ordinary. A staircase that would later appear in accounts of events that have never been satisfactorily explained. The landing at the top, quiet and just out of sight, the way the upper floors of small houses are always quiet and just out of sight from below. The story, properly speaking, was about to begin. The kitchen floor at 30 East Drive caught the morning light in a particular way in the summer of 1966. The linoleum was pale, a neutral domestic color somewhere between cream and gray, and in the early hours of an August morning, it would have held the light from the window in a single low rectangle stretched across the floor toward the far wall. Jean Pritchard would have known that floor well. She would have crossed it every morning, filled the kettle at the sink, set it on the hob, and stood in the quiet of the house before the day properly started. It was the kind of floor that showed everything: a muddy footprint, a dropped crumb, a ring left by a wet cup. So when something appeared on it that had no clear origin and no visible source, it was the kind of thing that was difficult to reason away. Joe Pritchard was not at home during the first days of August 1966. The accounts of the case note this detail consistently, as though the fact of his absence is part of the record that matters. Jane was in the house with the children, Philip and Diane, and the days would have moved in the ordinary rhythm of a family. In summer, school out, the estate quieter than usual in the warmth. There was nothing in the house that had changed. No new pipes, no new appliances, no recent work on the walls or floors. The kitchen was as it had been for months. And then something appeared on the linoleum that should not have been there, and Jean Pritchard looked down at it and could not account for it. And the case that would spend the next several decades acquiring names and investigators and a certain kind of quiet fame began in that moment, with a woman standing in her own kitchen looking at her own floor. The substance that appeared has been described differently across the various accounts that document this period of the case. The most consistent description is of a fine powder, pale in color, distributed across a section of the kitchen floor in a light, even dusting. Some accounts add a detail that has remained in the record without obvious explanation, that the powder had a faintly greenish tint, a quality that made it stranger than an ordinary household residue, which would have been white or gray or the color of flour or dried plaster. It was not flour. It was not plaster. John Pritchard did not have any product in the kitchen that could have produced it, and the accounts note that she searched for a source and found none. The substance simply sat on the linoleum as though it had settled there from somewhere, and the surface around it was clean and undisturbed, with no marks or scuffs to suggest it had been walked through or disturbed after it appeared. The even distribution of that powder is one of the details that recurs in accounts of the early phenomena at 30 East Drive. A dusted floor can look like a small thing from the outside, trivial even. A spill, a residue, something tracked in from outside. The obvious explanations arrange themselves quickly, but the characteristic that witnesses returned to was precisely that the powder appeared in a clean, undisturbed layer with no footprints in it and no visible origin point, no broken packet, no damaged container, no area where the concentration was heavier and then spread outward. It was simply there, and it had not been there before, and no one in the house had put it there. John Pritchard cleaned it up and went on with the morning, and then it appeared again. What followed over the next days was a second and more persistent phenomenon. Water began to pool on the kitchen floor. Not a spill, not a tipped glass, or an overflowing pan, or a wet cloth wrung out on the linoleum. The water appeared in standing pools in the middle of the floor, in quantities that were inconsistent with ordinary household causes. John checked the pipes under the sink. She checked the joints around the base of the worktop. She looked for any surface that might be condensing enough moisture to drip, and she found nothing. The floor was not near the sink. The pools were not near any water source. They simply appeared, and they were sometimes large enough that she had to fetch a cloth to absorb them, and when she returned, the floor was dry, and then later, wet again. A plumber was called to the house. This is a detail that appears in published accounts of the case and carries a particular kind of weight, because a plumber represents the ordinary world's response to an anomalous domestic situation, the rational professional, the trained inspection of pipes and joints and junctions, the systematic elimination of the mundane explanation. The plumber worked through the kitchen carefully. He checked the pipes under the sink and found nothing loose, nothing corroded, nothing dripping. He examined the joins along the kitchen wall where a hidden leak might have worked its way through to the floor. He looked at the space under the boards where a rising damp might have found a channel upward. He found nothing. He straightened up and told John Pritchard that there was no fault he could identify that would account for the water she was describing. He left the house with nothing to report. The water continued to appear. There is something in that detail, the plumber's negative finding, that the accounts of the case present with a quiet care. It is not the most dramatic element of what was happening at 30 East Drive. The powder and the water are small things set against what the case would eventually produce, but the plumber's inspection matters because it represents the moment when the ordinary explanatory framework was applied and formally failed. A professional, working within his area of competence, examined the problem and could not explain it. The water had no source. The kitchen floor remained dry until it was wet again, and no pipe or joint or fitting produced by a careful search gave any reason for it. Jean Pritchard's mother came to the house during this period. She is referred to in accounts of the case as Mrs. Scholes, and her presence in the house is noted as significant because she became an independent witness, an adult from outside the immediate family who observed the same phenomena that Jean had been describing. Mrs. Scholes was not a woman predisposed to alarm. The accounts do not describe her as particularly susceptible to anxiety or as someone who arrived at the house expecting anything unusual. She was Jean's mother, visiting in August, present in the ordinary domestic flow of the days. And she saw the powder on the kitchen floor, and she saw the pooling water, and the accounts of those who spoke with her afterward describe her expression, standing in the kitchen doorway and looking at the floor as visibly disturbed. That word disturbed is worth sitting with for a moment. Not frightened, not panicked, disturbed. It is a particular register of response, the register of someone whose ordinary understanding of a domestic situation has encountered something it cannot immediately accommodate. Mrs. Scholes was standing in a kitchen she recognized, in a house she knew, belonging to her daughter, and the floor of that kitchen was doing something that a kitchen floor does not do. She could not explain it any more than Jean could. She could not produce a source for the powder or a channel for the water. She stood in the doorway, and the accounts note that her expression changed, and then she stepped into the kitchen and looked more carefully, and the looking more carefully did not produce an explanation. The presence of Mrs. Scholes in the early record of the case is important for a reason that goes beyond her individual reaction. Accounts of anomalous domestic phenomena are frequently anchored in the testimony of a single household, a family who all lived together, who shared a psychological atmosphere, who might, a skeptical assessment would note, have influenced one another's perceptions. Mrs. P. Scholes disrupts that pattern. She arrived from outside the household. She had not been living with the phenomena day after day, developing a particular lens through which to interpret the kitchen floor. She came in, saw the same things Jean had been seeing, and could not explain them. Her witness account sits alongside Jean's not as a corroboration within the same household, but as an external observation from someone who had brought no prior context to the kitchen and left it unable to offer a straightforward account of what she had seen on the floor. The August days continued. As the powder appeared and was cleaned up, the water pooled and was dried. Nothing about the house changed. No new smells, no sounds beyond what a house makes ordinarily, no visible displacement of objects or movement of furniture. The phenomena were specifically and exclusively the powder and the water, and they were confined to the kitchen floor, and they had no clear pattern in terms of time of day or frequency or volume. They simply appeared at intervals without warning and without explanation, and the family cleaned them up and moved through the rest of the house in the ordinary way. It is worth noting how contained these early phenomena were and how specific. They did not spread through the house. They did not attach themselves to particular family members. They were not accompanied by sounds or temperatures or any of the more dramatic markers that later accounts of the case would include. They were domestic, almost mundane, confined to the kitchen floor, observable in plain daylight, measurable in the sense that a plumber could examine the relevant infrastructure and report back. The scale was small, a powder, a pool of water, two things that should not have been there and had no identifiable origin. That specificity is part of what makes them worth attending to carefully, not because small phenomena are inherently more credible than large ones, but because their smallness meant they were examined closely and without the kind of heightened atmosphere that larger events tend to generate. Jean Pritchard did not call a paranormal investigator, she called a plumber. The plumber came and found nothing and left. The water appeared again. The quality of light in a West Yorkshire kitchen in August is a particular thing. Warm in the mornings when the sun comes around to that side of the house, flatter in the afternoons when the clouds move in off the moors to the west. A kitchen floor in that light is simply a surface, pale and practical, showing what is on it with reliable accuracy. There was nothing on the floor, and then there was something on the floor, and no one in the house had put it there, and no external inspection of the property had produced a mechanism that accounted for it. Jean Pritchard cleaned the floor each time and went on with the day. The children moved through the house. The street outside continued its ordinary August routines, neighbors coming and going, the small sounds of other families and other houses on the estate, the particular quiet of a residential street in warm weather. Nothing about 30 East Drive distinguished it from any of the houses on either side. There is a pattern noted in the academic literature on recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis events, the term that parapsychologists use for the category of phenomenon that poltergeist cases are typically placed within. The pattern is one of onset, activity, and cessation, with the cessation frequently as unexplained as the onset and the activity. William Roll, who worked extensively on documented poltergeist cases and whose published work forms a significant part of the literature on the subject, noted this cyclical quality as one of the consistent features across cases examined from different countries and different decades. The phenomena begin, they continue, they stop. Often, no intervention or change in circumstance accounts for the stopping. The case at 30 East Drive would, over its full duration, exhibit this pattern across multiple phases. The first phase, in August 1966, ended after approximately 2 weeks. The accounts do not record what the last day of the first phase looked like. There was no dramatic conclusion, no final incident, no loud cessation, no obvious marker that indicated this was the last time the powder would appear, or the last time the floor would be found wet. At some point in the second half of August, Jan Pritchard cleaned the floor, and it stayed clean. The water did not return. The powder did not appear. She would have gone on cleaning the kitchen with ordinary thoroughness, checking the floor more carefully than she might have before, perhaps pausing in the morning to look at the linoleum before she crossed it. But the floor stayed as it was supposed to stay, dry and clean and empty. Joe Pritchard came home from wherever he had been, and the house was ordinary, and the kitchen floor was ordinary, and there was nothing to see, and nothing to explain, and nothing that a person returning from a period of absence would notice as strange. The family moved back into the full rhythm of the household. The summer continued toward September. The children would have been thinking about school starting again, and Jean would have been occupied with the ordinary business of the end of the summer holidays, and the kitchen floor lay clean and pale in the morning light, and gave nothing away. The question of what had caused the phenomena remained open. Jane Pritchard had not invented an explanation. The plumber had not invented one either. The powder had appeared and been cleaned up, and appeared again, and been cleaned up again, and then stopped appearing, and no one in the house or outside it had produced a satisfactory account of where it had come from or why it had stopped. Mrs. Scholes had stood in the kitchen doorway and seen enough to be visibly disturbed, and had no more of an explanation than anyone else. The case file, insofar as a file existed at this point, which it barely did, since no formal investigation had yet been initiated, contained two phenomena, a duration of approximately 2 weeks, one external professional inspection that produced no fault findings, and one independent adult witness whose reaction was noted and whose testimony confirmed the primary account. That is a modest record, on its face. 2 anomalous substances on a kitchen floor, no injuries, no dramatic events, a duration of 2 weeks, and a cessation with no identifiable cause. It would not have seemed, in September 1966, like the beginning of a case that would eventually produce multiple published accounts, academic comparisons to the most extensively documented poltergeist events in British history, and a house that would still be receiving visitors 50 years later. It would have seemed, more probably, like a strange fortnight that was now over and might never recur. The kitchen floor at 30 East Drive in the weeks after the first phase of activity would have been simply a kitchen floor again, linoleum, morning light, the particular sound of the kettle coming up to the boil on the hob. Joe Pritchard would have crossed it without looking down as carefully. The children would have tracked in the ordinary evidence of ordinary days, a grass stain from the garden, a scuff from shoes worn too long. The floor would have held all of it in the ordinary way, as floors do, and nothing unusual would have risen to the surface. The estate outside continued its own season. August on the Checkerfield estate moved toward the cooling mornings of early September the same way it did every year, the light changing angle, the gardens beginning to lose the height of their summer growth, the noise of children outside running slightly thinner in the evenings as the days shortened. The houses on East Drive stood in their rows, nearly identical, the small front gardens tidy or slightly overgrown according to each household's habits, the net curtains in the windows holding the same pattern of domestic privacy that every house on the street held. Number 30 looked the same as the houses on either side. It had always looked the same. What the accounts of the case note at the end of this first phase is precisely that ordinariness, the return to an ordinary household atmosphere, the kitchen floor clean and dry, the children moving through the rooms in the ordinary way, the morning routines settling back into their usual shape. That return to the ordinary is not a conclusion, it is not a resolution. It is more accurately described as a pause, the phenomena withdrawing back into whatever place phenomena of this kind come from, leaving the house and its family and its pale kitchen floor quiet and unremarkable and entirely unable to explain what had happened in the weeks just past. Joe Pritchard was home. The plumber had found nothing. The powder had not appeared for days. The water had not pooled. Jane Pritchard had cleaned the kitchen each morning and found it clean at the end of each day. And the house stood on its ordinary street in its ordinary town in West Yorkshire in the autumn of 1966. And the staircase at the back of the narrow hallway rose from the ground floor to the short landing above, and the morning light came through the kitchen window at its new, lower September angle, and the case that was not yet a case rested in the quiet certainty of ordinary things, waiting with no apparent urgency for whatever came next. There are phenomena in the documented record of this case that would arrive later, different in scale, different in intensity, involving different parts of the house and different members of the family. Those phases were documented separately and by different witnesses, and across a longer span of time. But the particular quality of these first weeks, with their quiet, specific, unaccountable strangeness, has its own place in the record. A powder on a floor, water with no source, a plumber who checked the pipes and found nothing to report, a grandmother who stood in the kitchen doorway with a changed expression and could not say what had put the substance on the floor any more than the family could. The case's first investigators, working from later testimony and written accounts, noted that the phenomena of August 1966 fit within the documented pattern of poltergeist case onset, ambient rather than dramatic, concentrated in a particular domestic space, witnessed by multiple people without a satisfactory explanation being produced, and ceasing as abruptly as they had begun. William Roll's work on this pattern, drawing on cases examined across several decades, describes the early phase of such cases as characterized by precisely this quality of modest specificity, events small enough to be plausibly explained by ordinary causes, but resistant to explanation when those ordinary causes are properly examined. The plumber's null finding is, in this framework, not a trivial footnote, but a meaningful part of the record. The ordinary cause was looked for. It was not found. The phenomena ceased without it being found, and the kitchen floor was clean. John Pritchard would have had no framework in the autumn of 1966 for placing these weeks into any larger pattern. She was not a paranormal investigator. She had not read Roll or Playfair or any of the comparative literature on poltergeist phenomena. She was a working-class woman living in a council house on a residential estate in West Yorkshire, and her kitchen floor had behaved strangely for 2 weeks and then stopped. She would have been glad it had stopped. She would have hoped it did not begin again. She would have resumed her ordinary mornings in the kitchen with the relief that ordinary mornings carry after a period of the inexplicable, and she would have crossed the linoleum without the small hesitation she had perhaps developed during August. The brief downward glance before putting a foot on the floor, the checking of a surface that had stopped being reliable. The linoleum would have been cool in the mornings as September came in, as the warmth of the summer ground slowly out of the house, and the heating would have needed to be considered. The light from the kitchen window shifted. The shadows across the floor moved. The floor was clean. It stayed clean. The extraordinary thing about an ordinary floor, in the weeks after it has produced 2 weeks of unexplained phenomena, is how completely ordinary it manages to become again. The evidence of what had happened was gone. The powder had been cleaned away. The water had dried. The plumber's inspection had left no visible trace. The kitchen was a kitchen, and it held the quiet that a kitchen holds in the early morning before the household is fully awake, and nothing on any of its surfaces indicated that anything unusual had ever occurred there. That quiet settled over the house in the late summer of 1966, and held for a period that the accounts do not precisely measure. The case's later documentation focused more on what came after than on the specific duration of this first interval of stillness. But the house was quiet, and the floor was dry, and the family moved through their ordinary days, and the estate outside moved through its ordinary autumn, and 30 East Drive stood on East Drive, looking exactly like every other house on the street, without distinction, without visible history, without any feature that would have made a passing neighbor look twice. The first phase of the case at 30 East Drive lasted approximately 2 weeks in August 1966. It produced 2 unexplained phenomena in a single room. It was witnessed by 2 adults, one of them outside the immediate household. It generated 1 professional inspection that found no mechanical explanation, and then it ended, without resolution, without explanation, and without any indication available at the time to anyone standing in the house of whether it was finished or simply resting the way certain things rest, quietly and without announcement, in houses that have no way of knowing what they contain. The figure was tall. That detail appears in every account. Whatever else witnesses disagreed on or remembered differently across the years, the height was consistent, a standing form that filled the upper part of the staircase doorway, broad at the shoulder, reaching close to the low ceiling of the landing above. And it was dark, not shadowy in the way a low-lit hallway is dark, not a trick of the light on the wall, but materially dark, a solid fabric darkness that moved or stood or simply was there in the space at the top of the stairs before it was not there at all. Witnesses who described the figure at 30 East Drive did so in terms that returned consistently to the same few physical details. The robe was long, reaching the floor. The hood was drawn up and forward. The hands were not visible beneath the sleeves, or were not noticed, or were not there to notice in whatever way the figure presented itself to the people who saw it. One account described the momentary impression of encountering a real person, a neighbor perhaps, or someone who had come into the house without announcement, before the recognition settled in that the figure was not a person in any ordinary sense, because it had ceased to be present without passing through a door, or turning a corner, or doing any of the things a person would do when leaving a room. It was simply there, and then it was not, and the landing at the top of the stairs was empty again in the low household light. The Cluniac order wore black. That is a verified historical fact, and it is the detail that investigators and researchers have returned to most consistently when considering what the figure described at 30 East Drive might represent. The Benedictines, who founded the Cluniac movement and from whom it derived its practices, wore dark habits in the earlier centuries of the order, but the Cluniacs became specifically associated with black robes, a detail that distinguished them visually from the white-habited Cistercians and from various other orders whose habits ran to gray or undyed wool. The image preserved in medieval illuminated manuscripts held in British archives shows the Cluniac habit in precise detail. The hood broad and deep, the robe floor length, the whole figure enclosed and vertical, the face in shadow beneath the drawn cowl. It is a specific silhouette. It is the silhouette witnesses described on the upper landing of a council house in West Yorkshire. The Cluniac Priory of St. John the Evangelist was established in Pontefract in approximately 1090. Founded by Robert de Lacy on land that formed part of his considerable northern holdings, following the Norman conquest. The priory was not a modest institution. Over the 2 centuries following its founding, it grew into one of the more significant religious houses in the north of England, with a community of monks whose black habits would have been a familiar sight in the town and surrounding countryside, whose bell would have marked the hours of the day and night across the fields and lanes of a medieval Pontefract that no longer exists in any visible form. The priory functioned for more than 4 centuries before its dissolution under Henry VIII in the 16th century, at which point the community dispersed. The buildings were progressively dismantled or fell into disrepair, and what had been a living institution became stone, and then became ruins, and then became, in most of its extent, simply ground. Those ruins still stand, in partial form, on the edge of Pontefract, low walls, the foundation lines visible in the grass, the outlines of rooms and corridors, and the spaces where the church stood, readable to anyone who walks the site with attention. On a weekday afternoon, the place is quiet. The stones are not dramatic. They are the ordinary kind of old that much of England carries without particular notice, present, weathered, unannounced, and the distance between them and the Chequerfield estate, between the medieval ground of the priory and the post-war housing rows of East Drive, is not great. The town folds around both of them. Whether any of that historical proximity is relevant to what was reported at number 30 is a question that investigators have considered without arriving at a satisfying answer. The theory connecting the figure to a specific individual, to a Cluniac monk allegedly executed at the Pontefract gallows, appears in published accounts of the case and has been advanced by various researchers as an interpretive framework for understanding who or what the dark figure on the staircase might have been. Local historians have noted, as a piece of separate record, that the land now occupied by the Chequerfield estate lay in close geographical relation to a public gallows site that served the town in earlier centuries. The Cluniac Priory was historically present and historically documented. Monks from that priory would have been present in Pontefract across the centuries of the house's operation. Whether any of them met an end at the gallows, and whether any such end is connected to what witnesses reported seeing at the top of a staircase in 1966 and in the years that followed, has not been established in surviving historical records. The executed Cluniac monk, as a specific historical individual with a name and a documented death, does not appear in any source that investigators have been able to identify. The theory persists. The evidence for its specific claims does not. What does survive? And what makes the black monk theory more than merely colorful local speculation is the precision of the match between the habit described by witnesses and the known visual identity of the Cluniac order. Witnesses at 30 East Drive were not, in the main, people with detailed knowledge of medieval religious orders. They were a working-class family in a post-war council house, and their neighbors and the occasional visitor who found themselves in the hallway or on the landing when the figure appeared. The Cluniac habit as a specific historical object, as a particular style of religious dress, distinguished from comparable robes by color and cut, and the specific drape of the cowl, was not part of the ordinary visual vocabulary of people in Pontefract in 1966, that they described what they described, and that what they described matches what a Cluniac monk would have worn, is the detail that investigators have found most difficult to account for by any simple means. The staircase was the center of it, not the kitchen, not the bedrooms, not the sitting room where the family spent their evenings. The staircase, running from the narrow ground floor hallway to the short landing at the top, was the location to which the figure returned most consistently, in which it was most often reported, around which the activity of the house seemed to organize itself. Witnesses described the figure ascending, moving upward along the staircase, in the way a person would move, though whether its movement precisely resembled human locomotion, whether the robes swayed, whether the footfalls produced sound, whether the whole physical impression was of weight and substance or of something lighter, varies across the accounts. Some described it descending, some found it standing still at the top, occupying the landing in front of the bedroom doors, neither moving toward them nor away. The landing itself was small, in a semi-detached council house of the type built on the Chesterfield estate in the late 1940s. The upper landing is not a generous space, a few feet of floorboard between the top of the staircase and the doors to the rooms above. Low ceiling, a single overhead light or none. A standing figure of the height witnesses described would have been close to the ceiling. It would have filled the space. From the hallway below, looking up the steep rise of the stairs, the landing would be partly visible and partly cut off by the angle, the last few steps, and then the low ceiling above, and in between whatever occupied that upper space. Visitors to the house who arrived without prior knowledge of the case, who had not been briefed on what to expect or what others had reported, noted the same thing independently, that the landing felt different from the rest of the house, colder, in the specific way that word appears in their accounts, not a draught, not the ordinary chill of a poorly heated upper floor, but a quality of cold that several people described as present rather than ambient, as though it had a location rather than a temperature. Diane Pritchard reported the most direct encounters with the figure. She was the younger of the two Pritchard children, an ordinary adolescent girl by all accounts of those who knew her during the period of the disturbances. Lively, unremarkable in the way that ordinary children are unremarkable, not given to excessive dramatization, or to the kind of persistent, anxious imagination that might generate repeated anomalous experiences as a symptom of something else. Her testimony, offered during the active period of the haunting in the 1960s, and maintained in interviews conducted across the following decades into her adult life, described encounters that were direct in a way that other witnesses' accounts were not. Where some people reported glimpsing the figure, seeing it at a distance or at the periphery, Diane's accounts described a closer presence, the figure proximate to her, encountered not as something observed from the end of a hallway, but as something present in the same immediate space. She stood at the foot of the staircase and looked upward. That image appears in the accounts of the case with the quality of a recurring moment, something that happened more than once across the years the family lived at 30 East Drive, something that her family members described having witnessed. Diane at the bottom of the stairs, still looking up toward the landing above. What she saw on those occasions, and what she described seeing in the account she gave later, was the figure in its black habit, standing or moving in that narrow upper space, present in the way only something with weight and substance is present, real in the specific sense that made it impossible, in the moment, to mistake for anything else. The physical encounters she described are the most difficult element of the case to hold at a comfortable distance, not because they are described in terms that suggest danger or threat. They are not, particularly, but because, if they are taken at face value, they describe something materially present in the house that was capable of contact with a physical person. Diane reported touch. She reported a proximity that went beyond the visual, an encounter with the figure that involved not just seeing, but being close to something that seemed, in those moments, to be close to her in return. What that means, in terms of the nature of the figure and its relationship to the physical world, is a question the case record raises without answering. The accounts are what they are. What produced them is something investigators have considered from multiple angles without reaching a stable conclusion. The question of why the figure, if it was what witnesses believed it to be, appeared with such consistency at this specific house, on this specific street, in this specific decade, is one that the theory of the Cluniac monk addresses only partially. If a presence connected to the medieval priory and its history had been associated with the land underlying the Chesterfield estate across the centuries, it would need explaining why it manifested at number 30 rather than at any of the dozens of identical houses built on the same ground within a few years of one another. Local lore and paranormal research have offered various answers to this. Some researchers have proposed that the Pritchard family, or a specific member of it, acted as a focus for activity that the location alone could not have generated. The adolescent child, as a potential focus for poltergeist phenomena, is a recurring observation across the literature on comparable cases, and Diane's age and proximity to the center of the reported activity has not been overlooked in assessments of the Pontefract case. Whether that focus was psychological, physiological, or something that current understanding has no reliable category for remains, like much of the case, an open question. The black habit is worth dwelling on as an object in its specific physical reality before returning to the figure it clothed. A Cluniac habit in the 12th or 13th century was a functional garment made to last heavy wool, dyed black with vegetable matter, cut simply and broadly to allow for the physical demands of a monastic life that included labor alongside prayer. The hood, the cowl, was a substantial piece of fabric in its own right, deep enough to shade the face entirely in certain lights, broad at the shoulder, designed as much for warmth in an unheated stone building as for any symbolic purpose. The hem reached the ground, the sleeves reached past the wrist. The whole construction was meant to render the individual body unremarkable inside a common form, to make the monk in habit less an individual and more an instance of the community, one black-robed figure among many moving through the same corridors and courtyard and church. What witnesses at 30 East Drive reported was a single such figure, alone on a staircase, the community it once belonged to dissolved and gone, the building it inhabited reduced to low stone walls in a quiet corner of the town. There is a detail in some accounts of the case that is easy to pass over too quickly. Witnesses who encountered the figure, or who were in the house at times when it was present, occasionally noted something beyond the visual, a quality to the atmosphere of the room or landing where it had been that persisted after it had gone. Not a sound, not a smell, something harder to name, a sense of density or of residual weight, as though the space had recently been occupied in a way that left some trace of that occupation behind. This is not a detail that admits of objective measurement or documentation, and it would be easy to attribute it entirely to the psychological state of people who had just had a frightening or disorienting experience in an unfamiliar context. Its appearance across multiple independent accounts, people who were not in conversation with one another about what they had felt, is worth noting as part of the record, even without knowing what to make of it. The staircase ascending toward that short landing, the low ceiling, the partial darkness above the last few steps, these are the specific coordinates of the central image of the Pontefract case, not the kitchen where the powder and the pooling water first appeared, not the street outside or the town beyond, with its ruined priory and its medieval history. The staircase is where the case finds its specific gravity, the feature of the house around which everything else organizes itself. And the figure at the top of it, tall, dark-habited, drawing its identity from a religious order that walked the fields and lanes of Pontefract 9 centuries ago is what witnesses reported seeing there, not once, not on an isolated occasion that might be explained away by fatigue or low light or the ordinary workings of a startled imagination, but across a period of years in accounts that remained broadly consistent across the decades in which they were given. Researchers working in the comparative tradition of poltergeist investigation have returned to the Pontefract case when considering the category of apparitional phenomena that accompany physical disturbances. The more common pattern in comparable cases is the absence of a clearly defined figure, activity without visual form, objects moving without any apparent agent, sounds without any visible source. The Pontefract case is distinguished, in part, by the specific and consistent visual identity of the figure that appeared alongside the physical phenomena. The black monk is not a vague presence or an undefined shape in the dark. It is a described entity with a particular form that witnesses agreed on. That specificity, the height, the habit, the hood, the floor-length robe, is unusual in the context of poltergeist cases, and gives this one a quality that other cases, documented more extensively, in other respects do not share. A question that investigators have raised in relation to the figure's appearance is whether the visual identity was in some sense constructed, not fabricated, but assembled from material already present in the environment. Pontefract is a town with a medieval history that is not invisible. The priory ruins stand on its edge. The castle rises above its roofline. A child growing up in the town might have absorbed some sense of that history without being able to articulate it, and a family living in a house where something unexplained was occurring might, under the pressure of that experience, reach toward available historical forms to make sense of what they were encountering. This is one hypothesis. It is worth holding alongside the alternative that a figure in a black monastic habit, specific in its visual detail and consistent across multiple independent witnesses, was present at 30 East Drive in ways that available explanations have not fully accounted for. What can be said with confidence is that the witnesses described what they described, and that what they described was specific enough to have a historical referent, and that the historical referent, the Cluniac order, the priory, the black habit, was genuinely present in Pontefract in the centuries before the Chequerfield estate was built on land that formed part of the town's older geography. Whether the connection is causal, coincidental, or something else entirely is not a question the evidence answers. The figure on the staircase was what witnesses said it was: tall, dark, robed, hooded, present, and then absent in ways no one who saw it could account for. What it was in any deeper sense has not been established. The upper landing of 30 East Drive, the low ceiling pressing down, the short run of floorboard between the top of the staircase and the bedroom doors, the household light not quite reaching the corners. Uninformed visitors, people who came to the house without having been told anything of its history, who arrived with no framework of expectation for what they might find, noted something about that space with a consistency that is itself a detail in the case record. Cold. The word appears in their accounts, independently, without coordination, not the cold of an open window or an uninsulated roof, but something more specific than that, something they had difficulty locating in any ordinary source. The cold of a particular place, the cold of somewhere that holds, in its particular air and in the dimensions of its walls and ceiling, something that has not yet been adequately named. The figure was tall. It wore a black robe. It stood at the top of the stairs, or moved on the stairs, or was simply there on the landing, when the light was low and the hour was late and the house had settled into the particular quiet it kept, when nothing was being thrown and nothing was moving on its own. It was there, and it had a form, and that form matched the habit of an order that walked this part of England 900 years ago, and the match between the two, the witnessed figure and the historical garment, is one of the specific details this case has carried through the decades since the first accounts were given. Undisturbed by the passage of time, still sitting at the top of the stairs in any honest examination of what was reported at number 30. Diane Pritchard grew up. She left the house as children do. She gave her accounts to researchers and journalists and documentary makers across the years that followed, in her adult voice, with the particular quality of a person describing something that has remained real to them across the full length of a life, not dramatized, not softened, not retracted, but simply present in the way that certain experiences remain present, regardless of the distance the years place between the person who had them and the moment they occurred. What she described at the top of the staircase, the figure, the proximity, the encounter that went beyond the merely visual, remained in her account what it had been in the original reports. The details did not expand into something larger than they had been. They did not contract into something more manageable. They simply remained what they were, an account of a figure in a black habit, present on the landing of a council house in West Yorkshire, doing what presences do when they are encountered in the particular space between certainty and the absence of explanation. The theory connecting the figure to a Cluniac monk executed at the Pontefract gallows remains a theory. The executed monk has no name in the surviving record. His specific story, if it is a story that happened, has not been located in any archive that investigators have examined. What remains is the proximity of the priory to the town, of the town to the estate, of the black habit to the figure on the staircase, and the question of what that proximity means, and whether meaning is even the right category to apply to a set of facts that may be connected or may simply be adjacent in the way that all things in a bounded geography are adjacent without implying any relationship beyond that. The staircase at 30 East Drive is steep, as those houses generally were. The landing at the top is small, a few feet of floor, a low ceiling, the doors to the rooms above ranged around it in the compact arrangement of a house built to house a family in the minimum necessary space without waste. A figure standing at the top of that staircase would be visible from the hallway below, visible in parts, the robe and the lower portion of the figure readable before the upper portion was, the hood coming into view only as the angle from the hallway changed or as the figure itself descended. That is the image witnesses described. That is the image the case has carried through more than half a century of documentation and retelling and investigation. A tall, dark, hooded figure, visible at the top of a steep domestic staircase in a council house in West Yorkshire, present in accounts given by ordinary people across a span of years that has not diminished what they reported, still standing in the record at the top of those stairs, in the particular cold of that small upper landing, where the light does not quite reach the corners and the ceiling is low above whatever it is that stands there. At the top of the staircase at 30 East Drive, there was a landing. It was small, barely enough space to stand in comfortably, with a low ceiling and a door to the adjacent bedroom set close enough to the top step that anyone standing there would have been partially in shadow. That landing, according to the documented record of the case, is where a great deal of what followed began. Not all of it, but enough that the staircase itself became the defining physical feature of the Pontefract case. The location investigators returned to most often, the space family members described with the most precision, the threshold between one part of the house and what was happening in the other. The first object anyone recorded finding was not at the top of the staircase, it was at the bottom. A piece of crockery, displaced from its place in the house and found in the narrow hallway below the staircase, on the linoleum floor near the front door, in a position it could not have reached by falling, sliding, or rolling from any known surface. The accounts do not all agree on exactly what the object was. Some describe it as a cup, some accounts say a plate. What they agree on is the position, well out into the hallway, away from any shelf or surface, with no one above and no one in the hallway at the time it was found. The Pritchard family, living in the house through the period when events of this kind were occurring most frequently, documented them with the careful attention of people who understood, even then, that the record mattered. What the record shows, across multiple accounts gathered at different times and from different people, is that something was moving objects at 30 East Drive, moving them from the upper floor into the space below, and that the movement was not quiet. The sound of an object thrown with force against a wall carries through a house. It carries through the walls into the houses on either side. Several of the witnesses who gave accounts of the disturbances at 30 East Drive were not members of the Pritchard family at all. They were neighbors, called in from next door by the sound of something striking the hallway, who arrived to find the family standing in the hall, looking at whatever had been thrown, and at the landing above them, which was empty. One account describes a neighbor standing in the open doorway of the house, having come over immediately on hearing the impact, watching as the family gathered around the object on the floor. The neighbor looked up at the landing. There was no one there. The front door had been closed until the moment the neighbor opened it. Nobody had passed the front door going out. Whatever had sent the object down the staircase was not, by any account that survives from the period, a person. The range of objects reported as having been thrown, displaced, or moved during the more active periods of the disturbances at 30 East Drive is detailed enough in the case record to convey something of what daily life in the house was like during those months. Crockery was among the most frequently cited, cups, plates, bowls, often arriving at the bottom of the staircase or in the hallway with enough force to break on impact. Kitchen utensils were found on floors, in rooms other than the kitchen, in some cases with the drawer or cupboard they had been stored in, still closed. Ornaments were displaced from shelves and windowsills. Cushions were found at the foot of the stairs. Small pieces of furniture were reported moved in ways inconsistent with ordinary domestic disturbance. Eggs were among the objects documented most specifically. Several independent accounts mention eggs being launched from the upper landing with considerable force and velocity, striking the hallway below and the wall beside the staircase, the marks of impact remaining visible on the paintwork. What makes the egg detail worth dwelling on is the way it sits in the record. Eggs are fragile. They break at the lightest knock. The fact that they arrived at the bottom of the staircase, having been projected with enough force to mark the wall, suggests a particular quality of force, not a slow displacement, not a gentle roll off a surface, but something thrown. Several witnesses independently described a specific aspect of the object movements that distinguish them from what an ordinary thrown object looks like, a pause or a floating quality before the final projection. An object would appear at the edge of the landing or be seen rising from a surface, and for a moment it would be airborne in a way that looked slow, and then it would be sent. The distance it covered and the force with which it arrived did not match the apparent gentleness of its initial movement. This detail appears in multiple accounts gathered independently from different witnesses describing different objects across different incidents. That does not establish it as fact. It establishes it as a consistency in the testimony, and in a case of this kind, consistency across independent accounts is the closest thing the record has to evidence. The walls of 30 East Drive also carry a separate thread through the documented account of the disturbances. During the later phases of the most active period, witnesses began noting the appearance of substances on the interior surfaces of the house, on walls, on furniture, on the edges of door frames. Paint was among the substances described, not spilled, not smeared in any pattern that suggested deliberate contact, but appearing on surfaces in positions that were difficult to account for. Some accounts describe marks at chest height on the wall of the hallway, a long horizontal mark of a dark color against the painted plaster, which no one in the family could explain. Other accounts describe unidentified substances, powdery or waxy or damp, appearing on the surfaces of furniture in rooms that had been closed and, to the best of the household's knowledge, unoccupied. This aspect of the disturbances is harder to assess than the object throwing, because surfaces in a house with children in it carry ordinary marks and smears that are easy to misremember or misattribute over time. The accounts that are hardest to dismiss are the ones that describe witnesses noticing a mark immediately after having been in the room and seen nothing there, the mark appearing in their account in the interval of their absence. It is worth understanding something about the physical layout of the house in relation to all of this. 30 East Drive is a semi-detached council house of a kind built in large numbers across Britain in the late 1940s and early 1950s. These houses were designed for practicality and economy. The interior spaces are modest. The staircase rises from the hallway just inside the front door, steep as these staircases typically are, narrow enough that two people passing on it would have to turn sideways with no return landing, running in a direct line from the hallway to the upper floor. From the bottom of the staircase, looking up, the upper landing is visible only partially. The low ceiling of the landing cuts the sightline just before the full space becomes clear. Someone standing at the top of the staircase would be visible from below only from approximately the chest up, depending on where exactly they were standing. This architectural detail matters because many of the accounts of what happened on the staircase involve witnesses at the bottom looking up and seeing or not seeing something at the top in that partial space just beyond where the ceiling cuts the line of sight. The physical phenomena at 30 East Drive did not remain at the level of displaced objects. They escalated. The accounts documenting the progression from ambient disturbance through object displacement to direct physical contact with a human occupant are consistent with a pattern that investigator Devick, studying poltergeist phenomena, have identified across multiple documented cases in different countries and decades. What happened at 30 East Drive during the period of its most intense activity placed it in the assessment of researchers who examined the case among the more serious British examples of this class of reported phenomenon. Guy Leon Playfair, whose comparative work on poltergeist cases is among the most methodical in the available literature, noted that the Pontefract case followed an escalation sequence he had observed in other high-intensity cases, beginning with substances and ambient sounds, moving through object displacement, arriving finally at apparent contact with persons in the house. The Pontefract case conformed to that pattern precisely. Diane Pritchard, the younger of the two Pritchard children, was the family member most directly involved in the most physically dramatic incident documented in the case record. Diane was a young adolescent during the period of the disturbances, described in family accounts and by people who knew the family at the time as an ordinary, lively girl. not given to unusual claims or dramatic behavior in her ordinary life. The accounts that describe what happened to her on the staircase at 30 East Drive are among the most consistently reported details in the entire case, described by multiple witnesses from different points of view, and maintained by Diane herself across decades of subsequent interviews given in different contexts and to different researchers and journalists and documentary makers. What the accounts describe is this. Diane was in the house during one of the periods of active disturbance. Family members were present. The sequence of events, as given by those who witnessed it, began with Diane at or near the foot of the staircase and ended with her being taken up, not walking, not climbing. The accounts consistently use language of compulsion, of being grabbed and drawn upward, of a force applied to her body from outside it, without any visible agency performing the action. The family members who witnessed what happened described her being taken up the staircase, and then the event ending, Diane at the top of the stairs, or at the landing, in a state of visible distress, the episode apparently over. What the witnesses and Diane herself described afterward was the physical evidence on her body. Marks were found on her arms, bruising described as consistent with the marks of a grip, the pattern of pressure distributed in a way that corresponded to fingers closed around the upper arm or wrist. The marks were noted by the family members present, and they are referenced in accounts given by those who saw them shortly after the incident. Diane's nightgown was also noted as disturbed in a way consistent with the physical account she and witnesses gave of what had happened. No one in the house was found to have caused the marks. The position of each witness at the moment the event began was according to accounts given at the time and since, known to the other people present. The question of who, if not an unseen agency, had produced the marks and caused the movement on the staircase was not one the family could resolve. It has not been resolved since. The bruising is the most somatically specific detail in the Pontefract case record. Object throwing can be attributed, at least in principle, to human agency. A person in the house, a mechanism not observed, a misremembered sequence of events. The appearance of marks on a person's body, consistent with forcible physical contact, witnessed by multiple people in the immediate aftermath, is harder to accommodate within ordinary explanations. That does not place it beyond question. Witness memory is imperfect. The urgency and distress of the moment shape what is noticed and what is reported. The record from 30 East Drive is not a controlled investigation. It is a family's account of what happened in their home, gathered in real time and then again over subsequent decades, and it carries all the limitations that entails. What the record does not contain is any alternative account of how the marks appeared. No one came forward. No mechanism was identified. The family's account of what happened on the staircase that night remained for all the attention the case received, without a counter-explanation. The Pritchard family's response to the disturbances over the whole period of the case is itself worth attending to, because it bears on how the events are documented. These were not people who sought out the attention. Joe Pritchard was a working man who had moved his family into a council house on an ordinary estate in West Yorkshire and had no interest in the paranormal before the events at 30 East Drive gave him reason to think about it. Jem Pritchard managed the household through periods of disturbance that would have been at minimum exhausting and disorienting. Objects broken, surfaces marked, the ordinary domestic life of the house interrupted by things she and her husband could not explain. The accounts given by the family in the period closest to the events are characterized by a quality of pragmatic puzzlement that researchers who have studied the case repeatedly note. The Pritchards were not dramatizing. They were, by all available evidence, reporting that quality, the pragmatic, slightly weary quality of people describing something they had lived through and could not explain, and would have preferred not to be known for, carries through into the subsequent decades of testimony. When Jean Pritchard gave interviews to researchers and documentary makers in later years, the register of her account did not shift toward the sensational. She described what she and her family had observed with the same level plainness she had used in the earliest accounts. The details she emphasized were the specific ones: the position of an object, the sound a thing made when it landed, the appearance of Diane's arm, not the interpretive ones. This consistency, across different contexts and over more than 40 years, is one of the features of the case that investigators have returned to repeatedly. It is also worth noting that the disturbances at 30 East Drive did not involve only the Pritchard family. The case attracted witnesses from outside the household throughout its most active period, and many of those witnesses were not people with any prior involvement in paranormal investigation or any particular inclination toward belief in unexplained phenomena. Neighbors who came over in response to sounds found objects on the hallway floor, and no one upstairs who could have thrown them. Relatives who visited during the more intense phases of the disturbances reported seeing things they could not account for. A pattern in the case record, noted by those who have studied it carefully, is that the most striking independent testimony tends to come from people who arrived at the house for ordinary reasons, visiting Jean, checking on the children, responding to a sound, and encountered something they had not been looking for and did not subsequently seek to publicize. The escalation at 30 East Drive did not proceed in a straight line. The case record, taken as a whole, describes a pattern of activity that surged and receded, with periods of quiet between the most intense phases of disturbance. Objects would be thrown, and things would mark the walls, and then the house would be still for days or weeks, the kitchen floor quiet, the staircase undisturbed, the ordinary sounds of the street outside the front windows, the only thing audible. These quieter periods did not mean the disturbances were over. The account of the case given by the family and by those who spent time in the house during the years of active phenomena describes something more irregular, a presence that was sometimes felt strongly and sometimes barely at all, an activity that seemed to follow no schedule the people in the house could predict or anticipate. This irregularity is one of the features that parapsychologists studying poltergeist phenomena describe as typical of the more serious documented cases. Predictable phenomena are more easily investigated and more easily attributed to ordinary causes. The phenomena at 30 East Drive resisted the orderliness that would have made them easier to examine. They appeared at different times of day and night. They affected different parts of the house in different phases. The objects thrown varied in kind and in force. The marks appearing on walls and furniture followed no pattern that a researcher could map onto a timeline and use to predict the next occurrence. This resistance to pattern is frustrating from an investigative standpoint. It is also, in the comparative analysis of documented poltergeist cases, extremely common. Guy Leon Playfair's comparative work on British poltergeist cases draws on a body of reported phenomena gathered across several decades and from multiple locations and households. What Playfair documented was a recognizable sequence that appeared, with variations, across cases investigated in different parts of the country by different researchers working at different times. The sequence begins with ambient disturbances, sounds, the appearance of substances, temperature changes, and moves through object displacement and the marking of surfaces before arriving, in the most intense cases, at apparent physical contact with persons in the affected household. The Pontefract case, in Playfair's comparative assessment, placed itself clearly within the most serious tier of documented British examples. The escalation had been complete. All the stages of the sequence were present in the record. The case had arrived, with the incident on the staircase at the furthest documented point of the progression. What Playfair also noted, and what the case record at Pontefract supports, is that poltergeist activity of this kind tends to be associated with particular individuals within an affected household, rather than with the household itself as a physical space, though the space is consistently the arena of the activity. In case after case, the most intense phenomena cluster around one or two people, typically younger, typically adolescent, whose presence in the house correlates with the presence of the activity. The Pontefract case fits this observation. Diane Pritchard was the family member most consistently involved in the most physically significant incidents. This is not by itself an explanation. Researchers have advanced different hypotheses to account for the pattern, some focusing on psychokinetic mechanisms, some on psychological or neurological states associated with adolescence, some on the possibility that certain individuals act as focal points for phenomena that are not themselves generated by the individual. None of these hypotheses has been confirmed. None has been conclusively ruled out. The pattern persists across the documented cases, regardless of how it is accounted for. The house itself continued to stand through all of it. This is a detail worth returning to periodically, because the physical solidity of 30 East Drive, its plaster walls, its linoleum floors, its steep, narrow staircase, its ordinary semi-detached form among the rows of nearly identical houses on the Checkerfield estate, is part of what makes the Pontefract case feel the way it does in the record. These events did not happen in an ancient castle or a ruined chapel or any of the settings that folklore associates with the unexplained. They happened in a post-war council house built for a working family on a street designed for people who needed homes, in a Yorkshire town that had been going about its business since the Norman period, without particular interest in the supernatural. The ordinariness of the setting is not incidental. It is the condition of the case. The setting also meant that the disturbances could not easily be sealed off from the ordinary world. In an ancient and isolated building, strange events might accumulate for years without anyone outside knowing. In a semi-detached council house, with neighbors on one side and families living all along the street, the sounds of objects striking walls carried. The presence of people from outside the household who had witnessed unusual things could not be concealed. The case at 30 East Drive was not entirely private. It was, in a small but real way, a collective experience, a household matter that kept requiring the involvement of people from beyond the household, neighbors and relatives, and eventually researchers, each of them arriving with no particular expectation and leaving with an experience they struggled to account for in ordinary terms. One account describes a period during the disturbances when the house was quieter than usual for several days, and the family moved through it in the ordinary way, cooking, sleeping, the children doing what children do, the front door opening and closing as Joe went to work and came home. Then, something was thrown. The specific object is not agreed upon in the various tellings of this period. What is agreed on is that after the quiet days, the resumption of activity came without warning, the object arriving at the bottom of the staircase with as much force as anything that had happened before, as though whatever had been still in the house had simply been waiting. The family's response to this resumption, as described in accounts from the period, was not terror. It was, by all the evidence available, closer to the particular tiredness of people dealing with something difficult that had returned after briefly seeming to be finished. The physical quality of the phenomena, the force of the objects, the marks on Diane's body, the sounds that carried through the walls to the neighbors, situated the Pontefract case within a documented tradition of poltergeist events, in which the phenomena are not merely atmospheric or ambient, but actively physical. There is a spectrum in the comparative case literature between poltergeist events that consist primarily of sounds and temperature variations and displaced objects on one end, and events that involve direct physical interaction with the persons in the house on the other. The Pontefract case occupied the further end of that spectrum. Not uniquely, other cases document similar escalations, some of them more prolonged, some of them more physically severe. But the Pontefract case sits clearly within the most significant tier of documented British examples, and the dragging incident on the staircase is among the most specific physical claims in the British case record. Investigators who have examined the case over the years since the disturbances have approached it from different angles. Some came looking for evidence of fraud, some came with established frameworks for poltergeist phenomena and wanted to see where the Pontefract case fitted. Some came with no particular agenda and simply wanted to understand what had happened to the Pritchard family in that house. What the sustained investigative attention produced was not a resolution. It produced a more detailed record, more witness accounts, more cross-reference descriptions, more careful documentation of what was claimed and by whom and under what circumstances. The record grew. The explanation did not materialize. The staircase at 30 East Drive was inspected by people who understood building construction and physics. No structural feature was identified that could account for objects being launched from the upper landing into the hallway below. The landing itself was measured and described. The ceiling height was noted. The door to the adjacent bedroom, which opened onto the landing, was examined. The banister at the top of the stairs was intact. Nothing in the physical structure of the staircase provided a mechanism. The building was, in its physical form, a modest post-war council house, solidly constructed, without notable peculiarity, entirely ordinary in its architecture. It did not contain any feature that explained what had happened inside it. The account of the physical phenomena at 30 East Drive, gathered across multiple witnesses, sustained over an extended period, including both ambient disturbances and direct physical contact, has been part of the British paranormal case record since the late 1960s. Researchers have examined it, skeptics have challenged it, writers have placed it alongside comparable cases from other countries, broadcasters have filmed in the house, and the case has been discussed in the literature on poltergeist phenomena in terms of both its specificities and its place within the broader documented pattern. Through all of that attention, the core account given by the Pritchard family has not been substantially contradicted. The marks on Diane's arms were real marks, noted at the time by multiple witnesses. The objects found at the bottom of the staircase were real objects in positions they could not have reached by ordinary means. The sounds were real sounds, heard by people who were not looking for anything unusual and who came to the house for ordinary reasons. Guy Lyon, Playfair, observed in his comparative work that the Pontefract case's escalation pattern was consistent with what the most serious documented poltergeist cases show: a progression from ambient to physical, from displaced objects to direct contact with persons, that has appeared in case after case investigated by different researchers working independently across different decades and different countries. The fact of this pattern, appearing with such consistency across cases that were not connected to one another, is itself the persistent open question that comparative poltergeist research has not answered not what caused the events at any one location, not whether the witnesses at 30 East Drive were telling the truth, though the evidence for their consistency over time is substantial. The deeper question is what the pattern itself, recurring in unconnected cases across the documented record, suggests about the nature of what is being reported. That question, at the time of writing, remains where it has been for decades. The events at 30 East Drive came to an end, in the sense that they ceased to be daily occurrences in the life of the Pritchard family. The family remained in the house. Life on the Checkerfield estate continued in its ordinary way. Objects stopped arriving at the bottom of the staircase. The walls stopped accumulating unexplained marks. The upper landing, for reasons that are no more explained than the reasons the disturbances began, settled into the ordinary quiet of a small space at the top of a narrow staircase in a modest house in West Yorkshire. A landing large enough to stand on, low-ceilinged, partially in shadow, and by all the evidence gathered over the years that followed, entirely still. Colin Wilson wrote about the Pontefract case at a desk in Cornwall, in a house on the edge of a cliff above the Atlantic. The lamp would have been on. The evening outside the window would have been dark. On the desk in front of him were the case notes from East Drive, alongside accounts of comparable events from São Paulo, from Newark, from a farmhouse in Rosenheim, Germany, the same pattern recurring across distances and decades that had no obvious connection to one another. What Wilson was doing in placing the Pontefract material inside that wider comparative frame was the specific act that carries a local case out of its original walls and into the permanent record. He was noting that what had been reported in a semi-detached council house in West Yorkshire was not unique. He was noting that it fit. The case moved, through that act of writing, beyond the kitchen floor and the narrow staircase and the family who had lived through it, and into the long, wide catalogue of things that have been carefully reported and never satisfactorily explained. Wilson's treatment of the case appeared in his published work on poltergeist phenomena, and brought the Pontefract story to readers who would never visit West Yorkshire and had no prior knowledge of the Pritchard family. He was not a parapsychologist in the formal institutional sense. He was a writer with a long-standing interest in anomalous experience, systematic, comparative, attentive to patterns across cases that superficially had little in common. His value to the Pontefract record was not investigative in the technical sense. It was documentary. He set the case in type and placed it alongside others, and in doing so gave it a kind of permanence that word-of-mouth accounts and local newspaper stories could not provide. The specific detail of a dark hooded figure on a staircase in Pontefract was now part of the international literature on the subject. It was indexed, it could be found. Other researchers, working independently, could read it and compare it to what they had found elsewhere. That act of comparison is part of what makes the Pontefract case worth sitting with at length. Wilson noted, as Guy Lyon Playfair had noted in his own comparative work on British poltergeist cases, that the Pontefract escalation pattern was not arbitrary. It followed a sequence that appeared, with variations, in cases with no connection to one another. Ambient disturbances first, unexplained substances, and sounds in water where water should not be, then object movement, then object throwing with increasing force, and finally, in the most serious documented cases, apparent physical contact with one of the human occupants. The Pontefract case reached that final stage. It was, in the comparative literature, one of the cases that had gone all the way through. Wilson placed it accordingly, not as the most extreme case he had encountered, and not as the most evidentially rigorous, but as one that fit the pattern with a precision that was, In his assessment, genuinely notable, the Pontefract case lacks the formal evidentiary architecture of some comparable investigations. The Enfield poltergeist, which unfolded in a council house in North London in 1977 and 1978, was investigated by members of the Society for Psychical Research and produced a substantial contemporaneous record. Audio recordings made at the time of reported events, photographs, a published investigative report, and the documented testimony of independent investigators who had been present in the house during active periods of disturbance. Playfair, who was one of the investigators at Enfield and wrote about it in detail, acknowledged in his comparative assessments that the Pontefract case did not have an equivalent evidentiary foundation. There were no investigators present during the most active periods in the way that investigators had been present at Enfield. The primary record for Pontefract consists of the testimony of the family, the testimony of neighbors and visitors who were present for specific incidents, and the accounts gathered by researchers who came to the case after the main period of disturbance had passed. That is a thinner evidentiary base. It is worth being clear about that, and the researchers who have worked seriously with the case have been clear about it. Playfair's comparative assessments treat the Pontefract material carefully, noting both the consistencies that make it credible and the absence of the kind of contemporaneous independent documentation that would have strengthened it considerably. What the case has, instead of that documentation, is the testimony of people who gave the same account, with broadly consistent detail across very different contexts and across a span of more than 50 years. That is not the same as contemporaneous recorded evidence. It is a different kind of record, and it carries different weight, but it is not nothing. Consistency over time, in the absence of obvious motive for elaboration, is one of the things researchers in this field attend to carefully. The Pritchard family did not become professionally involved in the paranormal. They did not build a career on the case or profit substantially from its telling. They gave interviews when asked across decades to television programs and documentary makers and individual researchers, and the account they gave remained, in its central details, the same. The figure on the staircase, the objects thrown from the upper landing, the powder on the kitchen floor, the water that appeared without source. These elements did not shift significantly in the retelling. The emotional texture of the accounts varied, as it naturally would, across years and different interviewers and different contexts, but the factual core held. Guy Lyon. Playfair's work provides the most rigorous comparative framework available for thinking about the Pontefract case. Playfair spent decades working in this field, beginning with his investigations in Brazil in the early 1970s and continuing through the Enfield case and beyond, accumulating a working knowledge of poltergeist phenomena across cases in multiple countries and cultural contexts. His observation that the Pontefract escalation pattern matches that of the most serious documented cases is not a casual endorsement. It is a comparative technical observation made by someone who had seen the pattern before, who had sat in houses where the sequence had played out, who had spoken to families at different stages of that sequence, who had a specific professional understanding of what the progression looked like. When Playfair placed Pontefract in that category, he was drawing on a body of first-hand experience that gave the comparison genuine weight. What the pattern means, whether it reflects something about the nature of the phenomenon or something about the way families under stress construct and transmit experience, remains, in his work and in the work of others, an open question. Playfair did not claim to know the answer. He claimed to know the pattern. The pattern, he noted, was there. The 2012 film, When the Lights Went Out, sits at a different point in the record than Wilson's comparative analysis or Playfair's investigative assessments. It was directed by Pat Holden, who was related to the Pritchard family, which gave it a personal connection to the original events that purely commercial horror productions lack. It received a theatrical release in the United Kingdom and reached an audience considerably wider than the readership of paranormal case literature. It was, by its nature as a dramatic film, not a documentary account of the events at 30 East Drive. It took the case material and worked it into a narrative with the conventions and requirements of the horror genre, a compressed timeline, selected incidents, the dramatic amplification that commercial film requires. What it did for the Pontefract case was not to document it, but to transmit it, to carry the name and the general shape of the events to people who had never heard of the Checkerfield estate or the Pritchard family, and to give the case a cultural presence in the mainstream that paranormal case literature could not provide on its own. Whether the film's treatment of the material is faithful to the specific texture of the reported events is a separate question from whether it served the case's place in the record. It served the record in the sense of extending it. The events at 30 East Drive were now part of a British horror film with wide distribution. They were, in that sense, part of the culture. The family's engagement with the case across the decades following the original events has been consistent, and by the accounts of those who have interviewed them, genuine. There is a specific quality to long testimony, to someone who has told the same story many times, across many years, to many different people, with varying degrees of skepticism and varying degrees of credulity. The account settles into a kind of steadiness over time. The details that are most certain become more certain. The details that were always uncertain remain uncertain in the same ways. What family members describe when asked about the figure on the staircase, or the objects thrown from the upper landing, or the marks left on Diane Pritchard after the dragging incident, is not the breathless quality of a story being told for the first time. It is something quieter than that, a fact being stated again, a thing that happened being described again, to someone else who is asked. The emotional weight has not left the account entirely, but it has settled. It has been carried for a long time, and has taken on the particular quality of something that has been carried, worn at the edges, certain at the center, unchanged in its essential shape. Diane Pritchard's testimony is the most central to the case because she was the primary focus of the phenomenon's more physically direct manifestations, and because she was old enough during the active period to form clear memories, and young enough that those memories have the freshness of childhood experience held into adulthood. She has given interviews at various points in the decades following the events, and what she describes, the figure, the physical contact, the marks, the specific sensation of being in that house during the active period, has remained consistent in its outline. Researchers who have spoken with her at different times have noted that she does not perform the account. She describes it. There is a distinction between those two modes that experienced interviewers can identify, and those who have worked with Diane Pritchard's testimony have generally noted that it falls on the side of description rather than performance. That assessment is not evidence in the formal sense. It is an observation about the quality of testimony, which is its own kind of record. Philip Pritchard, the other child in the household during the events, has also given accounts over the years, and the broader family circle, neighbors who were present for specific incidents, family members who visited during the active period, has contributed to a testimonial record that, while not amounting to the formal evidentiary structure of a contemporaneously documented investigation, is substantially wider than a single family's uncorroborated account. The picture that emerges from that wider record is of a house where, across a period of years in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, something that witnesses could not explain was reported by a range of people who had no evident reason to coordinate their accounts. The specific consistencies in those accounts, the upper landing as the primary location, the staircase as the axis of the most significant events, the dark-robed figure seen by multiple independent witnesses, are the features that have most consistently attracted the attention of researchers. A single family's account of a figure on their staircase is one kind of claim. The same figure, described in comparable terms by people with no prior knowledge of the family's account, is a different kind of claim. The Pontefract record contains both. 30 East Drive stands on its street in Pontefract today, in much the same form it occupied in 1966. The external structure is that of an ordinary post-war council house, the same roofline, the same small front garden, the same brick facade as the houses on either side of it. There is nothing in its exterior appearance that marks it as different from its neighbors. It does not announce itself. Someone walking along East Drive without prior knowledge of the case would pass it without hesitation, noting nothing. The front garden is tidy. The front door is the same kind of door as every other front door on the street. The house is simply there, in the way that all the houses on the Checkerfield estate are simply there, built for ordinary occupation, occupied for decades by ordinary families, absorbed into the ordinary fabric of a West Yorkshire town. The interior is also, in its basic structure, the house it always was. The narrow hallway just inside the front door, the staircase rising steeply from the hallway to the short upper landing, the kitchen where the powder appeared on the floor in August 1966, and where the water collected in pools without a source, the rooms upstairs where the figure was seen, and where, by some accounts, the temperature dropped in ways that visitors without prior knowledge of the case consistently noted and remarked upon. The house has not been substantially altered. It remains in its physical form the same building. The staircase is the same staircase. The upper landing is the same upper landing. Whatever was reported in that house was reported in this house, in these rooms, on these stairs. The property is currently operated as a paranormal investigation venue. It is available for overnight rental to individuals and groups who wish to spend a night in the house with whatever equipment they choose to bring: temperature gauges, audio recorders, cameras, electromagnetic field meters, the range of instruments that contemporary paranormal investigators typically deploy. Bookings are taken in advance and are, by the accounts of those who manage the property, consistently in demand within the British paranormal investigation community. The house is not empty between bookings. It receives a steady stream of visitors who arrive in the evening, set up their equipment in the narrow hallway, in the kitchen, and the staircase in the upper landing, spend a night in the house, and in the morning compile whatever they have recorded. The booking diary for any given month is full, or close to full. The demand is not declining. What those visitors report is its own category of record, distinct from the Pritchard family's testimony and from the accounts of the neighbors and friends who were present during the original active period. Contemporary investigation reports from 30 East Drive describe with varying frequency and varying specificity temperature anomalies at the upper landing, audio phenomena in the hallway and on the staircase, objects moved or displaced during the night, and occasional visual reports from individual investigators that they describe in terms consistent with the original witness accounts: a dark shape, a tall form, something at the top of the stairs that was there and then was not. These contemporary accounts are not formally verified. They are the self-reported observations of people who have come to the house expecting the possibility of anomalous experience, and who may or may not be reliable witnesses in the strict investigative sense. The researchers who work carefully with this material hold it at its appropriate weight as part of the ongoing record, suggestive rather than conclusive, consistent in some details with the original reports, while being impossible to evaluate with the rigor that the original events were never evaluated with either. The case was not rigorously investigated in real time. The contemporary visitor reports are not rigorously verified. Both halves of the record have the same limitation, and that limitation does not make either half worthless. It makes both halves the same kind of material, which is the material the case has always been made of. Reported experience, carefully noted, never fully explained. The persistence of the demand is, in its own way, a fact about the case. People continue to want to spend a night in that house. They continue to find the experience, whatever it amounts to in evidentiary terms, worth making the journey for. The Pontefract case has not faded in the way that many locally documented paranormal cases fade once the original witnesses age and the immediate community moves on. It has maintained a presence in the British paranormal investigation community for more than 50 years. New investigators arrive. New visitor reports are filed. The booking diary stays full. Whatever draws people to 30 East Drive, curiosity, the desire for an experience, the long human interest in places where something unexplained was reported, does not appear to diminish with time or with the absence of the original family from the house. The house continues to receive the attention that the original events generated, long after those events themselves have passed into the record. Colin Wilson, sitting at his desk in Cornwall with the Pontefract notes open in front of him, was working at the boundary between the documented and the unknown that this kind of case always occupies. He was not attempting to resolve the question of what had happened at 30 East Drive.
He was attempting to describe it accurately and place it in appropriate comparative context.
That is the task that the case has always set for anyone who engages with it seriously, not to determine whether the phenomena were real in the physical sense, because the evidence does not permit that determination, but to describe as carefully as possible what was reported, by whom, with what degree of consistency and corroboration, and against what historical and investigative background. Wilson did that. Playfair did that. The researchers who have continued to work with the case in the decades since have done the same. The Pritchard family, in continuing to give their accounts accurately and consistently across 50 years of interviews, have also done that. Their testimony is itself a form of documentation, careful and maintained. The case as it stands in the record is not a closed file. It was never formally investigated in the way that would permit a formal conclusion. No institutional body examined it with the rigor that would allow the evidence to be assessed, the witness testimony to be evaluated under controlled conditions, the physical phenomena to be observed and measured in real time. What happened at 30 East Drive was not that kind of case. It was a family's experience, witnessed by their neighbors and family, and by the occasional visitor who happened to be present when something occurred, reported in the accounts of researchers who came to the house after the most intense period had passed and gathered what testimony they could find. That is a particular kind of case, not the best evidence kind, not the easiest to assess, but not an empty kind either. Cases like this one carry a different weight from those that were investigated in real time. They carry the weight of accumulated testimony, consistently held across a long span of time by people who have not changed their account and have not obviously benefited from maintaining it. The figure on the staircase was described in black. The habit reached to the floor. The hood was drawn forward so that the face, if there was a face, was not visible. The figure was tall, taller, by the accounts of those who saw it, than an ordinary person. It appeared at the top of the stairs, and it was gone. Multiple witnesses described this at different times without prior knowledge of each other's accounts. That convergence is part of the record. Whether it constitutes evidence of something beyond ordinary explanation is a question the record does not answer. The question remains where it has always been, sitting at the edge of what is established, neither resolved nor dismissed, simply open in the way that the most careful and genuinely puzzling cases remain open, present, persistent, and without a bottom. The house on East Drive is there now. The staircase is there. The upper landing is there, in its smallness, a few feet of floor, at the top of a steep flight of stairs, in a narrow post-war council house in a West Yorkshire town. The rooms are quiet during the day. At night, on the nights when the booking diary shows a reservation, people with equipment bags and thermal cameras will come through the front door and stand in the hallway and look up toward the landing and set up their instruments and wait. They will spend the night in the house. In the morning they will leave, carrying whatever they recorded, and the house will settle back into its quiet. The booking diary will show another reservation for the following week, and the week after that, and the month after that. The house receives visitors. The staircase receives them. Whatever was in the record at 30 East Drive when Wilson set it down in type, and whatever Playfair noted in his comparative assessments, and whatever the Pritchard family described in interview after interview across more than 50 years, continues to draw people to the house in Pontefract on a quiet residential street where nothing from the outside distinguishes one semi-detached house from another. The story moved beyond the house a long time ago, carried by Wilson's desk in Cornwall, and by Playfair's comparative work, and by the family's steady testimony, and by the film that took the events and shaped them into something a cinema audience could sit with. It entered the literature. It entered the culture. It became one of the cases that people who work in this field refer to when they are trying to establish what the most serious British poltergeist reports look like, what their escalation pattern is, what their typical duration is, what the relationship tends to be between the phenomena and the human occupants of the house where those phenomena are reported. The Pontefract case is part of that comparative foundation now. Its limitations are acknowledged. Its consistencies are noted. Its central question, what was reported in that house and what would account for it, has not been answered, and there is no obvious mechanism by which it is going to be answered at this remove from the original events. The witnesses are older now. Some of them are gone. The house remains. The record remains. On a weekday morning in Pontefract, when the street is quiet and the neighbors have left for work and the school run has passed, and East Drive has settled into its ordinary mid-morning stillness, 30 East Drive looks like every other house on the Checkerfield estate. The front garden is tidy. The curtains are drawn. The front door is closed. The street outside is unremarkable in the specific way that all these streets are unremarkable, built for ordinary life, occupied by ordinary people, maintaining the same general appearance decade after decade as the town around them continues in its own ordinary way. A car passes. A dog is walked past the gate. The morning goes on. Inside the house, the staircase rises from the narrow hallway to the short upper landing, just as it always has. The kitchen is quiet. The upstairs rooms are quiet. The landing at the top of the stairs, that small still space where multiple witnesses described what they described, is quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when nothing is happening in them, which is most of the time, and which is what an ordinary house mostly is, quiet and still and continuing. The booking diary shows reservations for the coming weeks. People will come, They will stand in the hallway with their equipment and look up at the landing. They will spend a night in the house and write down what they noticed.